Hey everybody, my name is Jim Frymer. I'm an arts reporter in Atlanta. I'm also the festival director of Out on Film, Atlanta's LGBTQ film festival. In Georgia Oakley's stunning directorial debut, Blue Jean, it's 1988 England, and Margaret Thatcher's conservative government is about to pass a law stigmatizing gays and lesbians, forcing Jean, played by Rosy McEwen, a gym teacher, to lead a double life. As pressure mounts from all sides, the arrival of a new student catalyzes a crisis that would challenge Jean to her core. Please welcome the director, Georgia Oakley, and the star, Rosy McEwen.
Hey, thanks for having us.
I've,
Hi. Yes, thank you.
I've seen this film 3 times. I adore this film. So thank you.
Oh,
Thank you both for making this film. I really appreciate it. We'll start with you, Georgia. How did this project come up?
Well, I was researching other things at the time. I was working with the producer Ellen on another film, and I came across a newspaper article about Section 28, and I was struck by the fact that I had not heard of this law, despite the fact that I had been at school during the time that it was in place. It was a law for 15 years in the UK, so 2003, and so I started to kind of piece together aspects of my own history that I hadn't previously understood. Notably, why I had grown up with a complete absence of queer role models, and why in my school there was just no mention of homosexuality whatsoever. And I hadn't really understood that. And many of the people around me at that time in London who were part of the queer scene had not heard of it either. So that was kind of the impetus to start researching. And whilst I was researching, I found some interviews with lesbian PE teachers who had worked under this law in the late 80s and early 90s. And I was fascinated by the fact that this situation that they found themselves in forced them to kind of splinter off their identity and attempt to kind of juggle multiple identities at once, and live like a double life, I guess, and that was in the end not sustainable. And most of those women ended up having some sort of huge mental health crisis or having to quit the profession. So yeah, it was an amalgamation of some of those stories and the women that we met along the way in the research, and also a sort of investigation into my own history as someone who had grown up during that time.
Okay. Rosy, did you know much about Section 28?
Shamefully, no, I actually didn't even know it existed, which is awful. Which is, now that we've been talking about this so much, it is awful. We've been at so many screenings, and I thought, because Georgia hadn't heard of it either, that wasn't that abnormal, but most people had. But I think that was ultimately why one of the main reasons I wanted to do it, was because how great to be part of telling a story that's, I assume, loads of people don't know enough about, and ultimately needs to take up its rightful space in our history.
Gotcha. This film is just so beautifully crafted and written, such three-dimensional characters. Rosy, can you talk a little bit about Jean and who this character is at the beginning of the film, both professionally and personally?
Gosh, who is Jean? I think she's a woman pretending. I think she's wearing a lot of masks. I think she's frustrated and sad and self-destructive, and everything we shout at Jean, saying, Jean, just say it, no one cares, she's saying it herself. And I think we meet her at a time when she's balancing her plates, and she thinks she's got everything in order. She's got her home life, and then she's got her Viv and her girlfriend, and that's very well hidden. And then she's got her school life, and she thinks she can keep all of those plates spinning. And then when Lois comes in, that disrupts that. And then when her and Viv start to break down, and she thinks that she's losing Viv, and ultimately does, she starts to crumble. And I think the paranoia grows. And I think this huge thing that she fears, these invisible shackles that she's got around her, she feels like there's no way out. And it's ultimately only in the end when she finally says the words out loud. And then we have that scene where she laughs, which is my favorite scene, because she realizes this thing that she's been imposing has ultimately come from herself. But it's not her fault. She is a product of the society that she's in. It is the subliminal messaging that she's been receiving since the moment she was born, of heteronormativity, that has forced her to have to look inwards her whole life.
Okay. Georgia, In terms of your research, what all did you do? And were you able to talk to a lot of people who were around during this time?
Yeah, not only did we speak to lesbian PE teachers who had worked at that time, but we also spoke to members of the activist community who had been, fighting back against Section 28 at that time, and politicians and women who were part of the women and men who were part of the queer community in Newcastle at that time. We must have spoken to upwards of 50 people during the research phase, interviewed them, and then some of those we met more and more and more, and they stayed like as a part of the kind of we're not just about development, but we're a part of the whole production, and have stayed a part of the whole experience of making the film. So yeah, I mean, the research phase was extensive, and we continue to find out details from people who would tell us, like for instance, the Bog Fund, which is mentioned at the end of the film, that was a real thing. And it was actually, I found out recently, we did an interview with someone who had been a beneficiary of the Bog Fund. She told me, I only found this out afterwards the other day, that it was actually called the women's committee fund, and WC is the same as WC, i.e. loo, i.e. bog in the north of England. So the Bog Fund came from the Women's Committee Fund, and this woman who interviewed me the other day said she was a beneficiary of that fund. So yeah, we found out about that very late in the process, and thought that it was a good way of kind of articulating some of the things that we had been wanting to explore in the film. So that found its way in very, very late. So yeah, the research informed the story right up until the very end.
Right. Okay. Rosie, can you talk a little bit, as you mentioned, between the relationship between Jean and Viv?
Yes, I remember Georgia telling me a story about one of the women who we spoke to and who helped us, who experienced this life that Jean lived. And so her name was Sarah, and Sarah said that one of the things that happened during that time, of many things, was that her relationships broke down because she wasn't free, and she had this sort of foreboding energy around her that meant that she couldn't actually completely commit and allow herself to like fall in love with these people and be the person that she wanted to be for them. And I remember Georgia telling me that story, and Sarah had said it to you over coffee very early one morning, and it was like a 9 a.m. meeting, and she'd really broken down mentioning this, and that really stuck with me. And then when I met Carrie, and she's so special and amazing, and very quickly we got on very well, and the space that Jean and Viv ultimately created felt very freeing for Jean. She sort of became very childlike, and Viv allowed this part of her to come out, and actually there's no other person or place that Jean really gets that freedom. So I think the stakes for the relationship just grew higher and higher the more that Jean and Viv connected, the more that me and Carrie connected, and the more that we found our language as a couple. So ultimately, I think it became one of the most important things in the film. And I think on reading the script, it might not necessarily have been that, but it sort of grew as the shoot went on and we kept talking about it.
Georgia, how would you say that the character of Lois changes the landscape here?
Well, I guess I wanted to look at the question of the sort of intergenerational aspect of queerness, and how sometimes it's very easy to kind of we all live in a vacuum to some extent. We all are only privy to our own experiences in some way, and particularly within the queer community, it can be hard to look at those who came before or those that have come after and identify with their experiences. And so I always wanted to show not just this kind of mounting pressure on Jean through the arrival of Lois, the student who she runs into in a gay bar, but also the way that the student kind of becomes the teacher by the end of the story, and that to me seemed kind of fitting for some of the experiences I had, and I wanted to touch on that. You know, it's hard for Jean to imagine what Lois is going through, because she's so focused on her own stuff. And then it's hard for Lois to imagine why on earth somebody would behave how Jean is behaving, because she's a teenager and she's focusing on her own thing. And so yeah, I guess that was why I brought in the character of Lois, and also probably, although I feel like all the characters are me in some way, a version of me, I feel like the one that I probably relate most closely to is the teenage character who has this sort of like simmering rage about the state of things. You know, that's sort of how I remember being at that age, and probably still am a little bit now. So yeah, I wanted to bring in that character and show through her how, you know, these other aspects, like the community aspect of the story, is really important. And obviously we see Jean stepping into a new world in the queer bar and the lesbian housing co-op, but through Lois we see the real importance of those spaces, and how she might be chewed up and spat out by the school system, but that there is hope for that character and that person because of the community, and that I found to be the true, you know, the kind of what most people who were around at that time, who had ended up dropping out of school and this, that and the other, you know, that's where they found solace. And I always wanted to make a film that had some hope, so it was important to kind of pair those things together.
Okay, I think I got like 3 more minutes. I want to ask this question of both of you. This film feels so topical and relevant right now, especially with what's going on in the United States. Can you both talk about? I'll start with you, Rosy.
Yes. It is so topical. I think obviously it's a film set in the 80s, but ultimately it's the tiny little microaggressions, conversations, snippets of things that Jean hears that are, as Georgia has mentioned to me, moments from life today. Yes, it's got amazing 80s soundtrack, but ultimately so much of the stuff that happens could easily be replicated or put in the context of today, and I don't think people would be surprised.
I would add to that, you know, we were aware of the sort of cyclical nature of the politics when we started developing the film. We were aware that there were kind of echoes of some of the things that had happened that we'd touch on in the film. For instance, kind of protests going on in the UK, where parents didn't want to send their kids to school because the kids were going to be taught that gay people exist, basically, or that queer people exist. And so we were aware of some of the kind of political overlap, but we were not aware that in the next 5 years things would continue to unravel at a really alarming rate. And now I feel like when we pitched the film, we had to kind of really underline the similarities between things that were happening in the 80s and things that are happening now. Whereas I think now it is impossible for somebody to watch Blue Jean without seeing the parallels, because the parallels have become more kind of glaringly obvious, unfortunately, and that was not something that we could have predicted.
Exactly. I have less than a minute. This isn't a question. I just want to make a comment. When we showed this film and out on film, the women adored it. And one of the things they use more often is the phrase authentic. This film just feels so authentic. So thank you both for making this film and for making a film that is so relevant and just, you know, people respond to so much. I really appreciate your time today, and I hope the film is a monster success.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was great chatting.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Chatting.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thanks, Jim.